Hey, everybody, welcome. Aloha, I'm Natalie, and this is Life After a Cult, the channel where we expose cult nonsense, we laugh at the absurdities, and we hopefully unbrainwash ourselves in the process. Now, let me ask you, y'all, have you ever caught yourself saying, maybe I'm just overreacting, even when someone clearly hurt you? Or maybe you second guess your memory so much that you start feeling like some kind of unreliable narrator of your own life. I feel like I speak from experience on that sometimes. Well, today we're talking with psychologist Jordan Horan about gaslighting, but not just the kind of gaslighting that happens to you, but also the kind that can happen in your own head. So hopefully I'm not the only one that can relate here. If you have any question or comment, if you could put question or comment in front of them, I can keep an eye on those and star those so we can get to as many as we can. Thank you so much, moderators, for being here. I appreciate it. And everybody in the live chat, good to see you. Look at that. Even Jesse's here. Awesome. No one, good to see you. I saw Greggy too, and Fire and Ice and Leslie. We're getting the whole gang here. If you could all do me a favor too, hit that like button. We can get some notifications going out. And without further ado, I'll welcome Jordan here. Welcome, welcome. Good to see you again.
Hi, thanks again for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And you're looking really nice and clear right now. We've been working around a little bit of Wi-Fi issues.
Good, good. If something happens, just let me know and I'll see if I can fix it.
I will. I can hear you well. So if it goes in and out a little, we should be okay. I let Jordan know there's some Wi-Fi work going on in my area, but I expect everything to be fine. But if I suddenly disappear, Jordan's going to have to just do the show. So
I don't know if I could fill your shoes. I'll try.
hopefully it won't come to that. Usually if there's storms, sometimes that'll happen, but I think that will be okay. And if you're new to the channel or you've only been you haven't caught Jordan before, he is a psychologist and educator. And we got to know Jordan when he went to speak in Michigan when Scientology was trying to push through one of their proclamations. And Jordan stood up and just said some wise things. And I was like, we need to talk to this guy. And now you've been on a couple times and the audience has had some really good questions. And based on the feedback that I got last time you were here, we decided based on that we need to talk about gaslighting, which is common not just in cult or high control groups, but in all kinds of places. Would you mind starting us out with just kind of talking about what gaslighting really is?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we have what we can call like the everyday lexicon, the words that we use like in our language, and then we have like scientific terms, right? And a lot of our everyday language and scientific terms don't always match up, right? And sometimes it's more of the idea of these general terms that we use in everyday language either were first scientific terms that then become like kind of lose their scientific meaning, or vice versa. They start as like general terms that we don't have a ton of scientific evidence for. And gaslighting is it's one of these interesting terms. As far as the psychological research is concerned, and my understanding of the literature, I was doing some reading today, as far as a psychological scientific term, the research is still in its infancy, right? So like kind of teasing out what it is and these kind of things. But the American Psychological Association does provide us with their definition. If anybody wants to do this, what you can do is you can actually go to like just Google APA dictionary, and then you can go up there and you can look up the scientific terms for a lot of psychological phenomena. And you could do that with gaslighting. So according to the APA's definition and some of the scholarly definitions, when we talk about gaslighting, the definition is, quote, to manipulate another person into doubting their perceptions, experiences, or understanding of events. The term once referred to manipulation so extreme as to induce mental illness or to justify commitment of the gaslighted person to a psychiatric institution, but is now used more generally. It is usually considered a quote colloquialism, though occasionally it is seen in clinical literature, referring, for example, to the manipulative tactics associated with antisocial personality disorder. So when we unpack how gaslighting has typically been used in the scientific literature, most of the literature has used it in the terms of intimate partner violence and intimate partner relationships, though there is some research that are starting to expand this as kind of like we've talked, high control groups and like that pressure of how it's used. So to kind of concisely state it, gaslighting appears to be this phenomena used by the gaslighter, person A, towards the gaslightee, person B, where it appears to be a form of psychological manipulation where a person then begins to doubt their experiences or to doubt their knowledge. So it's this coercive tactic used to some people in the literature describe it as a sense of destabilization. When you've been gaslighted, people report this experience of just kind of like unease and like being on shaky ground, and it causes this internal confusion. So again, in our conversations, we'll clearly probably extrapolate from some of this, but I just wanted to give us that psychological scientific definition of kind of how we're using it.
That is almost word for word what happens in Scientology, especially the C organization, being made to doubt your reality and your perception of what happened. In fact, there is a procedure in Scientology, say that something happens in your life, let's say with Scientology itself, where you feel you were mistreated in some way, and you bring it up and you're like, hey, this violates even L. Ron Hubbard's policy, like that shouldn't have been done. And what often gets done is they're like, oh no, actually that's not what happened.
Yeah.
Not what happened. And if you don't accept that, there are procedures. One is called false data stripping. If you don't, because if they're showing you, well, L. Ron Hubbard says this and you're not accepting it, you have to be stripped of your false information. And coupled with it is, if you try to say, well, actually I saw this, I saw David Miscavige punch Mike Rinder, which is something that actually happened. I didn't witness it, but other serial members did. No, you didn't see that. I mean, it's totally like that.
Yeah, you're painting a good example, a good picture of how this appears to be. And again, one of the keys of gaslighting, and I think we're really getting to, and that is a key component of gaslighting, is power in relationships and the imbalance in the exercise of that power. So again, in this example, if we look at the C organization as an entity that possesses power over the individual, they're exerting that confusion, right? They're trying to manipulate your perception from what you saw with your own eyes. I know in this example, right, there's been reports that David Miscavige punched Mike Rinder, right? And then saying, no, what you saw actually wasn't the thing. That is a clear example of gaslighting. And then again, we could even boil it down to the person who told you that you didn't see it, or person X claiming that they saw it. That would be a clear example of gaslighting. And again, too, because my understanding, right, like Scientology, it's predicated on these levels of power, whether you're along this path, the ladder, right, or you just have different jobs and these kind of things. There is an inherent power differential, and it's usually someone higher up telling the person below them, no, that's not true. Oh, you're wrong. And then, of course, then you get into these other interesting dynamics of false memory stripping or whatever, however you
False
term
data
that.
stripping. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a clear indication of what we would consider gaslighting.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how would we know if we were being gaslit? You mentioned a little bit that feeling of unease, and I can look at my own past, mainly in Scientology. And it's interesting because now that I think about it, I'm trying to think. I feel like after leaving Scientology, after quite some time and starting to gain an understanding about how they gaslit us in Scientology and the Sea Organization, I, at some point in my life, way later, I feel like it's honestly only been the last few years. I feel like my 50s did something magical to me. And I was just like, oh no, you are not shaking my reality. I see what I see and I don't care. I don't need you to acknowledge what I see for me to feel good about it or comfortable in it. Like I've become inoculated in a way against gaslighting because I was gaslit my entire life. And each time I would give in to, well, I guess, I mean, they must know better. This is my church, or these are my seniors. These are executives. These are people higher on Scientology's bridge than I am. So they must know better. And I felt that unease. But can you talk a bit about maybe some other symptoms or feelings where you might not be recognized that you're being gaslit?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and a really good one. And one, again, kind of that hallmark is kind of that unease, and this is where it gets kind of difficult, right? Because just in general, our perceptions can be wrong. You know, as human beings, like we have these faulty information processing systems. There's a lot of things that people believe that just aren't true, right? But I do think that when we get into these situations, especially, I would say, if it's especially some sort of intimate relationship and or one where there is a power differential, and maybe you're constantly thinking like, oh, there's something wrong, and then checking, right, verifying, talking to other people. Again, these aren't going to be foolproof methods, because again, usually our support systems tell us things that we want to hear, right? So this may or may not be the greatest method, but I do think that talking with other people, whether that be, some of the gaslighting literature has looked at like in employer-employee relationships, maybe talking with some of your coworkers and being like, you know, the boss said this, and like, that doesn't seem, I don't remember that in this meeting. I remember it this way. Like, and basically you're comparing notes, I guess is the best way to say it, is find someone that you can compare notes with who was either in that situation, right? Or even get outside perspective if you can, I think would be really helpful. And then seeing if that data triangulates. And then again, too, you know, some stuff that I kind of go to, what do the experts say? Again, so like, you know, you relying on expertise is a very beautiful thing. So again, to give you an example, maybe your spouse is continuously telling you that fluoride in water causes cancer. Because so the Kennedy Jr., head of the Department of Human Services, is on this crusade to rid public drinking water of fluoride. According to the American Dental Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics and a lot of scientific bodies, from my understanding, is fluoride is safe. That's one of the reasons that we put it in the drinking water. Not only is it safe, fluoride as a mineral appears to help enhance teeth safety. And then again, you throw in all of the stuff that we consume with a lot of sugars and stuff that cause cavities and other chronic problems.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with the body of knowledge from the experts at the American Dental Association and being like, okay, put my faith more in them than what my significant other says, right? This probably isn't the greatest example, but again, I think if it comes to claims of the natural world, you can rely more on them. Again, it does kind of become confusing when it is more subjective, because this is what makes gaslighting difficult to kind of detect. Is gaslighting tends to be discreet and covert, right? Especially when we look in intimate partner violence, right? It's usually, in most of the research, in these heterosexual couples where the male, it tends to be a male telling a female, you're misremembering that. That never happened. It's like, as far as an event that happened between the two of them or three people, it's really hard to be like, maybe it didn't happen that way, right?
Yeah.
But I also think too, again, when you're in those situations of talking to people who know you best and be like, hey, does this sound like something I would do? You know, we'll say Mike, the male, is like saying that I'm acting crazy and I'm misremembering things. Does that sound like something I would do? So again, you're kind of relying, I'm belaboring the point, but one of the best ways seems to be to seek that outside perspective.
Yeah.
And hopefully, again, if your friends or family are raising concerns about the significant other, like, there's something off about them, or that might be a decent data point to at least investigate. Like, maybe this person that I'm with maybe isn't the best person for me, because there are probably different forms of gaslighting and psychological manipulation in these kind of things. And I actually read a study that was just published this year in the Journal of Family Violence. And they were looking at these different personality traits of people that are more likely to manipulate people. So what we call like Machiavellianism, being more pessimistic about human relationships, people higher in what we call psychopathy, that is being callous and cold, and people being higher in some of these other kind of constellations of traits. So they'll do things they're charmers, is what I'm getting to in my rant, is people that tend to gaslight other people in these relationships are very superficially charming. And so if you're in a relationship and you're not maybe seeing it, but someone from the outside is seeing some manipulation or some concerning behaviors, that might be a decent data point that, I should maybe listen to my friend or family member and at least investigate their claim further.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm like kind of tangential there, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Now, because I've been reading and seeing the term that you can actually gaslight yourself. And how does that happen? How do we gaslight ourselves? And that is really doing it.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Honestly, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into any of the literature of if that is a thing. I mean, the way that I would look at it from what we know of psychological science is, to a degree, human beings, we are very good at, it's called motivated reasoning.
Yeah.
We tend to reason our way to something that we want to agree with, right? So maybe it is tending to, you reason your way to agree that this person is actually a good fit for you when all the evidence suggests that it's not, or that this person is manipulative because they've done this, and this. But you reason your way to, no, they're actually not. So I'm skeptical of using the term gaslighting ourselves. I would look at it more of, there are various reasons why people wouldn't want to necessarily accept the facts at face value.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that makes sense. Like Mama Opal saying there, it's just like talking yourself out of something that like, Scientology is abusive. Yet, like there were a million times when I wanted to leave.
Yeah.
And I gaslit myself in that way, I think, because I was like, no, I didn't feel right about it. I didn't like it. But then
Yeah.
the mind control that they use when they gaslight us is designed so that if we start thinking that way again, that it kicks in. No, I got false data stripping on that. The true information is L. Ron Hubbard says this, yet it's just black and white evidence right here to the contrary. But we're like, no. And I think in a high control group, especially from my experience in Scientology, and maybe people in the chat, let us know your experience with gaslighting too. That talking ourselves out of it when we know this is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, and so again, and this is kind of where language gets kind of fuzzy, right? Like, so
Yeah.
for me, if you wanted to call it gaslighting yourself, like I mean, whatever we want to call it, but it seems that we are on common ground. We're talking about this phenomena where we tell ourselves stories. Again, I would kind of consider it more motivated reasoning and justification and stuff. A lot of things that we tend to do naturally that started from the psychological pressures from the group that we then internalize. So basically what you do is you take the voice of the person doing the false data stripping and you've internalized that to yourself, and then you get into this doubtful loop. So that's how I would explain how maybe that's working. And then Scientology is so good at reinforcing that you don't really need someone else to gaslight you, because you've been conditioned to doubt your experiences and always have to look at. I think maybe we're getting on something really powerful here again, right? Is because most in day-to-day life, we trust our perceptions and our experiences, whether they are true or not. But Scientology really indoctrinates that disbelief and that self-doubt, where now you're turning outside yourself instead of using yourself as that compass of, okay, is that true? Is that not? It's constantly, they make you reliant on Big Brother in a sense, or make you reliant on them to get your reality, and then that kind of feedback loop that it seems to generate.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, and that is so much the experience in a high control group, where the brainwashing is self-imposed a lot. There are a lot of people, or I've had this question a lot when people find out about just how abusive some of the practices in Scientology can be. The physical abuse by David Miscavige, the covering up of physical, of SA, all of that. Yet the blinders come back on, and you have to convince yourself that no, or maybe because it was this, and you're just trying to put this square peg into this round hole, and it's just not, it's not fitting. There are a couple, let me grab a couple of questions here too, that are on the topic here. Gotta Love It is asking, what's the best way to deal with someone who is trying to gaslight you?
Whew. That is a great loaded question. I'm gonna couch this from the standpoint, again, because most of the research and comes from intimate partner violence relationships. And whenever we talk about this realm, I think safety is key, right? So I'm not one of these people who be like one solution fits all, like Scientology claims, or like do this. So I'm just couching this in that caveat.
Yeah.
Because again, in intimate partner violent relationships, there's already violence in that. So the way you confront a person could be dangerous.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, depending on the situation, depending on, if it is a violent relationship, that's probably different. If it's a relationship that you're in, and maybe the person is unaware, though a lot of the research suggests this is targeted. Like this isn't the gaslighter, the way that we talk about in the scientific and clinical literature, they know what they're doing. There may be an aspect of sadistic behavior where they actually derive some pleasure from manipulating people. So if you're in a relatively safe relationship with someone and they're doing it, I mean, again, I don't know if anybody's tried to trick gaslighters or whatever, but because it falls into this constellation of other concerning behaviors in relationships, you know, you could have a conversation with them like, hey, you know, you told me this, but that's not how I remembered it. Like it appeared to be this. And then, you know, I think having a conversation, you know, in part of like a couples counseling or something like that, in kind of a neutral, safe, maybe way to explore that. Because again,
what if it's like a work colleague? So gotta love it. Follow that up with like, well, what about in a work situation?
Yeah, again, that can be really tricky. So if it's colleague to colleague, I'm always a fan of, depending on who you are as a person, if you're a little bit more assertive, confronting them on that. Sometimes when you confront people and you basically call their bluff, sometimes they're less likely to continue that behavior because, like, I got your card, I know what you're doing, and then they go find someone else to mess with. But again, I'm thinking of when it comes to like at work and those kind of things, I am really a fan of going to a higher up. And again, I'm a fan, I'm couching this in the terms of, I'm also a fan of a paper trail. So for example, during any work dispute or anything, you know, talk to your manager or your boss, expressing your concerns, and then send them an email right after you're done and say, hey, I just want to, you know, basically follow up and thank you for the meeting where we discussed X, Y, and Z. You know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
And that way you actually have like a record of a conversation that took place at a certain date and time. And then again, that's a piece of data for yourself. And, you know, I'm always kind of planning for worst case scenario, kind of thinking that way. If a person is continuing to do that, you at least say, hey, I went to the manager, so that way that the employer can't say, oh, that was never a problem. I expressed that to my supervisor. And or again, going to HR, right? Like most companies, I'm thinking kind of larger companies, right?
Yeah.
Where you can go to the HR person expressing your concerns and be like, hey, this is the problem. So without knowing like kind of too many variables, and I guess speaking in generalities, I really think going to a higher up, like a manager, a boss, you know, sending them an email that the conversation took place, and having that as kind of some evidence that you expressed your concern about this thing. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, that's good advice, documenting it. And like you said, having a conversation and then following up with an email. Hey, great. We had this talk about blah, 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 1, 2, 3. And I think that is good advice if you're working with somebody who tends to be a little bit of a gaslighter or a bunch of a gaslighter, is to be able to document like that. And the nice thing about that, you're right, because you can refer back to that. You can refer back to an email and then know for sure, you know, what you said. Because we all, you know, you ask 5 people to watch the same car wreck, you can get 5 different stories. It's not always too that because someone thinks that you didn't see it or perceive it right, doesn't mean they're trying to gaslight you. Because I mean, sometimes we are wrong. And I think that's kind of that trick is figuring out, like, because every time somebody tries to tell us that's not what happened, we can't just be like, oh my God, you're totally gaslighting me.
That's one of my problems with like the term and kind of how we think about it, is like, because everything now appears to be gaslighting. And so like, that's kind of the caution again, why I kind of like couched some of my, you know, people could be, you could be wrong, right? Of what you saw or what you interpreted. To me, one of the signs really appears to be a pattern. right?
Mm.
It's like you're consistently having this interaction with this person and you're consistently walking away like, what? Like that? No, like that happened. Right? Like if there's a pattern of behavior, then it's like, okay, you're probably more likely to be onto something. And again, going back to like creating an email, right? And like for memory purposes and having that clear documented, because I think what happens a lot of times in workplace disputes or just what have you, it becomes he said, she said, or, he said, pointing fingers back and forth at each other. But if you have an email, like if you have something that is like time, date stamp, like there it is, it's right there. You have evidence. Yeah. It's all about gathering evidence, and it's less of kind of pointing your fingers. And then you can say, nope, we had this conversation. I told you about my concerns, and this is what happened right here.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And even Maxi 2022 says, make sure you get written examples of how the gaslighter has tried to abuse you. Use emails, texts, letters. That can also, yeah, you can establish that pattern. And that makes sense because I feel like I've known a few people, mainly when I was in Scientology, with the gaslighting. Like I can really recognize that. But I can also see how, sometimes that's not what's being done. But it really, I think you really hit the nail on the head earlier when you said there's that feeling of unease, right? And when it's somebody, I think it's especially, this is my opinion, that it's especially tough and traumatizing when you're being gaslit by somebody you trust. If it's in the situation of a romantic relationship, or in my situation in the C organization with people senior to me that I always looked up to, that I always thought were there doing, the same purpose, yet they were completely gaslighting me anytime I started to look over here and go, well, actually, this is not really lining up over here.
Yeah,
it doesn't get worse when it's someone you trust.
Yeah, it's so it hurts even more, right? Because and again, this is why gaslighting is tricky, and if why it can be messy, because it's human relationships and it's people that we're close with, especially again if we narrow down to like intimate relationships. I mean, we are very good at deluding ourselves for love, right? Like it's something, it's amazing how quickly and easily we do that. I mean, I'm sure we've all had experiences where we were attracted to someone who probably wasn't good for us, right? And that just appears to be a part of the human condition. My students and I, we talked a few weeks ago about the social psychological phenomena of like human beings. We are highly social creatures. We appear to be evolutionarily predisposed in this social sense. So we do things to maintain those bonds, because one of the most harmful, or one of the things that hurts us the most, is losing a relationship. Loss of a relationship is a significant correlator with depression. Losing a relationship. There have actually been, my students and I, again, we talked about this. There have been some studies where we get people to come into a lab, and we use this paradigm or this type of study structure. It's called cyberball. And what we do is we have people come into the lab, sit down at a computer, and play this computer game. And in this computer game, we toss a ball back and forth with avatars. And while you're a participant in the study, you are told that you're playing with other participants. Hey, there's someone else in another lab room and they're playing cyberball with you. There's people all over campus that are playing this game. And so what happens is there actually aren't people playing with you. It's completely the computer program. And initially the computer program and you toss the ball back and forth. You get the ball a lot. Then the algorithm and the rules change, and you become excluded, where the computer, unbeknownst to you, the computer starts tossing the ball to other participants. You are excluded. The area of the brain, I believe it's the cingulate cortex, related to physical pain, is the same area that is active or lights up during this game, We've stuck people in the MRIs and looked at brain activity. So this suggests that from the standpoint of social exclusion, and suggests that we're highly social, the same areas of the brain that are associated with physical pain are the same areas of the brain that are associated with social exclusion, and suggest why it is so physically painful for us.
Wow.
So to go back to gaslighting, we don't want to really think that someone is manipulating us, especially if we're in these relationships where you look up to them, right? Like you said, like you cared for these people. These people probably gave caring acts to you as well. They probably weren't all monsters. And that's what makes this hard. And going back to interpersonal relationships, we can recount on our mind, you know, we hear this sometimes in stories of and experiences of people in horrible relationships. They'll be like, well, he's not bad all the times. You know, maybe there are numerous instances of physical violence, but the person being abused will say things like, well, no, he can be really sweet. He can do this. Again, I'm just going to say this. My opinion is, someone lays their hands on you, they're not a good person. They will probably do it again to you. The biggest predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And if someone is willing to go to the degree to put their hands on you and be physically violent, they're probably a physically violent person. And that's probably the sign of you want to get out. But what I'm saying is there are these psychological needs that we have for relationships, making picking out gaslighting sometimes that much harder in keeping us in some of these relationships.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Celine is asking, can passive aggressive behaviors be a form of gaslighting?
That's a really interesting question. Maybe. I'm trying to think about, so usually when we talk about passive aggressive behavior, right, is
I think a lot about like how, like I live in the Midwest now, and I was born and raised in Hawaii, but raised in Scientology. So there's always, with growing up, there's this conflict of, you know, living aloha, and then there's Scientology.
Yeah.
And I know when I moved to the Midwest, people don't always just say what is they want or what they mean, or you know, they just are like quietly upset about that. And I don't understand that always. I understand it more now. But coming out of especially that Scientology environment where it's just like, you got a problem, boom, you're writing the person up, or you're confronting them on it. And that's kind of more how my family was, because my family, being a big Polynesian, Asian influenced family, we're like, let's talk about it.
It's interesting you bring that up, because you know, when we talk about how culture influences behaviors, you're right. There appears to be certain culturally, and again, I would argue, kind of like what you said, you know, being from Michigan, you know, being in the Midwest. As far as styles of communication, some people are more indirect communicators, and some cultures are more direct. You know, just generally Asian cultures tend to be kind of more direct. In the Midwest, there is this kind of like, oh, it's fine, right? Like that could potentially be a passive aggressive behavior. But I don't know if that would be the same
as gaslighting. Probably not.
As gaslighting, because again, when a gaslighting, that manipulation is key, like that active manipulation. So I don't know, maybe if the person has like a specific example, that might be helpful. But I just off the top of my head, I'm not able to draw like a clear connection right now. But that is a really interesting, good question.
It is so interesting how things are culturally different, not just country to country, but even like within the United States, the differences in the culture, the Midwest versus the West Coast and the East Coast. When I first moved to Minnesota, I was working for my parents. They had a company where they sold awards, trophies, and plaques. And I was the sales manager, and I worked directly with customers. And I would often be asked if I was from the East Coast. I didn't know why.
That's
did.
funny.
I'm like, oh, is it the dark hair? Because, I am a mix of nationalities,
Mhm.
but it was happening so often. It took me probably well over a year of living in Minnesota to recognize how more direct I was.
Yeah.
Not in I felt in a rude way, but I do better with that direct
Yeah.
communication. I
Yeah.
don't do well. I don't read between the lines well. If
Yeah.
you're upset with me, but you're saying it's fine, I hear
Yep.
the words. I'm like, all right,
Yep.
good. Like I'm literal.
Yep. Yep.
So I don't
No.
pick up on that. So people close to
Yeah.
me know if you're upset with me, you have
Yep.
got to tell me. I will not pick up on it.
100%. And that's just, largely, like you said, like cultural communication. So some people are just more kind of sideways about it, or like, oh, it's fine or whatever. And
Yeah.
again, kind of more assertive. And assertive is not bad. I mean, assertive is just
Yeah.
like you're direct. But real quick, I want to make another point
Yeah.
about regional differences in behavior and personality. Actually, today with my class, we were talking about personality psychology. And I showed them a map where personality personality traits based on groups, we see differences, again, kind of what we're talking about, based on regions of the United States. So there was a study done, I forget what the researcher's name was, and they looked at the personality trait of extroversion. Extroversion is a personality trait dimension where some people score higher, some people in the middle, some score lower. And it's about being highly social. Like people higher in extroversion like going to parties. They like loud events. They tend to talk more to strangers. Extroversion has to do with they tend to feel more positive emotions, like cheerfulness and happiness. Well, what some researchers has found is that there are differences in geographic regions throughout the United States about where the average extroversion score of a state or a geographic region falls. And interesting
Whoa.
enough, Minnesota and Michigan tend to be in the second quartile. So if you chop things up into quartiles, actually, like Florida tends to be in the first quartile. So in the top states, as far as people in Florida tend to be more extroverted. But then like people in Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin are in the second quartile. People from Alaska tend to be in the lowest quartile. People from Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana tend to score the lowest as a group in extroversion. So getting back to, it's interesting how we can see there are these geographic differences in how people think, feel, and behave. And this is kind of one of the interests of interesting things about how our cultures influence us. So thank you for letting me rant about that.
That's fascinating. If that's
Yeah.
something that's available online, I would love a link to share with our audience at some point. I can put it on a community post. If
Yeah.
there's an image of that, I think
Yeah.
I would find that fascinating.
Yeah.
And it is so true because I was born and raised in Hawaii. I lived on the West Coast, but when I lived in LA, I was in the Sea Org. So I was only around Sea Org and Scientologists.
Mm-hmm.
But then I lived in Seattle but it wasn't as different. But moving to Minnesota, there was a distinct difference. And I had to learn to be a little, my partner Tony used to call it being a little softer. And I never was, like I don't believe in being direct in a rude way at all.
Yes.
But I much rather you ask me, just tell me what it is you want to know. In fact, I will get, and I can't remember, I don't think Nancy's here, but Nancy's probably listening. She's one of my moderators and she knows like one of my pet peeves is unclear written communication.
Yeah.
Or asking me something with no context. And because my brain, I'm doing what I'm doing. And if you are referencing something we talked about 5 minutes ago, I need you to say, oh, that thing, and bring it back up, not just talk like we just talked about it. Cause then I'll be like, what, like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And it just makes me crazy. And then I realized that I think that comes more from in Scientology, so much of our training as staff members or in the C organization, or at least mine, was around getting us to, we did, oh my gosh, there are these courses that we did that took literally years for some people, where you would learn, there was a book about this thick. It was of small common words in the English language, a, and, them, they, it, all the little ones, right? We had to read and learn every definition of every word, use it in sentences, and do so much more when it came to grammar and the English language, solely so that we could read, understand, duplicate, and execute an order with no alteration whatsoever, and that we could write orders that people could read, execute, understand, duplicate, and enforce. Now, that sounds like, oh, I mean, it's kind of a good skill to have, and I do believe that it is, but just like most things in Scientology, it's so over the top. Like, you don't need to do a book this big to be able to do all of that. But what and L. Ron Hubbard said he was making us super literate.
That's interesting. It reminds me exactly of the book 1984. Right, so the character there, he has to go through the dictionary, and they're consistently getting rid of words and writing, the words, because they have to think a certain way, right? That's like exactly like 1984, like a thought. They call it kind of like the thought police, right? Yeah. And so what you're doing is, because some of our thoughts is related to language. There's nonverbal thinking, but that's one way that you can control people. The problem with that approach is, I haven't really looked at the literature of this, but I think most people just are our intuition is the human mind is an inference generating machine. Like, so even when we have like explicit directions, there's going to be some individual differences where we try to infer what the meaning is based on our experiences, based on a host of different factors. So I'm of the mindset of like, I don't think it could ever really work, maybe in some kind of crazy way, but that's really interesting and seems like a huge waste of time, by the way.
Yes,
like it was. It made you do that.
It was overkill, like so many things in Scientology. You don't have to take it that far.
Yeah.
It's nuts. Gorf is saying, sounds like Scientologists wouldn't get along with folks with
ADHD. I was thinking the same thing. I don't mean to laugh, but right, typically people with ADHD typically have difficulties with sustained attention. That's one of the symptoms. And if you have them sit there and try to read an entire book of just like really boring stuff, probably not going to be super effective and super helpful for people with for some people with ADHD.
Yeah. Well, and many did. Like, I can look back and recognize how, wow, that person probably have ADHD, and they got into so much trouble and they were punished so heavily.
Yeah.
Especially in the Sea Org, because it wasn't acknowledged, understood, or accepted, that their brain just worked in a different way. And often the further I get away from Scientology, the more I start getting a little bit more feedback. Like, are you sure you don't have ADHD?
That's funny. That's funny.
And my kids, couple of my kids have ADHD. My partner has Tony had ADHD, and I was surrounded by people. Some of my closest friends have ADHD, and I can see it and recognize it. But I think in the Sea Org especially, we were made to, I've heard this term masking. We were made so much to like mask and cover those things up and try to show up as our cult personality.
Yeah.
Not who we actually were, which most of us were way more goofy than we were ever allowed to be. We were never allowed to express that side of ourselves. If you wanted to survive in that environment, you learned how to mask. You learned how to do that. And even though I've been out of Scientology for 15 years, it's still that figuring out, who I really am, because there's no, well, who was I before Scientology? I don't know. I was before.
Real quick, I wanted to make a comment on the masking. It's a term that's used a lot, right? But I go back to this. there's only so much. To me, masking is the recognition that you might be punished for a behavior, so you regulate it.
Yes.
But when it comes to neurodevelopmental disorders, you're not going to mask your ADHD. Like you just said, these people are trying to read this book, and it's clear as day that they can't do it. They're getting so. We could go. I'm not going to go on that tangent. I mean, unless you wanted to, but this idea of masking to me is kind of we clearly regulate our behaviors based on the social situation, right? But what I'm saying is, like, you're not really going to be able to mask ADHD. That's something, or autism. Like, you're not really going to be able to mask that. Like, we're going to see, like, you know, all these correlates and all these behaviors because these neurodevelopmental disorders are by definition behavioral. So, like, you can do things to mitigate them, right?
Yes.
But if you're someone who talks excessively, again, a symptom of ADHD, we're going to see that. People in the Sea Org are going to be like, oh, yeah, that person never shuts up, right? Like, there's not, like, you can regulate, you can decrease it, but I'm going to argue that most people would be able to point out that person who talks a lot as the person that talks a lot. It may be blunted, I guess, is what I'm saying. So I guess when people talk of masking, I prefer to think of it more as you're trying to exert some behavioral control.
Yes.
But you're not going to not show your symptoms because by definition, signs are observable to people. We're going to see these behavioral correlates. That's a tangential thing, but I just thought it was worthwhile to bring up.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It really does. You know, one of the things that when I think about people still in Scientology and especially the Sea Org, that breaks my heart is knowing that some of the most simple problems and issues that they have and the difficulties that they deal with would be so resolved if they were allowed to seek actual mental health treatment, if they were even allowed to understand what ADHD is, what the autism spectrum is.
Yeah.
It would explain so much for a lot of people, and it just goes untreated, unacknowledged. And those individuals that are, especially the people who are neurodivergent, end up being, in my opinion, it's worse for them, because I saw so many times people being punished where now I can recognize that as, wow, that was some ADHD behavior. They weren't trying to be a problem. It's just their brain works differently. And now, having raised kids, like my partner's kids, one of them has ADHD. And as he was growing up, I was already out of Scientology. I'd read a bunch of books about it, tried to learn about it, and realized how important it is to know, because you wouldn't communicate or handle that person the same, especially as a child. And how, like, I was reading about how somebody with ADHD, if you're screaming at them, there's that part of their brain that just shuts down. You're not going to get through to them. They've shut down and there's no coming back unless you give them the time to go kind of reset. And this is something that's nonstop in the Sea Org, where you were just hammered on. And I remember seeing people shut down in those ways. They're definitely going to have to, like, clean up a lot of that stuff, I think. And the only way that they're ever going to get help for it is leaving.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think you're hitting the nail on the head here of, like, people are being chained to, like, their suffering. Like, the tools are here. We have them. You know, I'm not saying we have all of the answers, but again, it's to me, it's the paradox of Scientology, of a group that claims to have answers to all of the answers to help people. One, doesn't, and then two, inherently prevents people from seeking the things that would actually helpful. To me, that is like the kind of the biggest evil of the entire organization. And so we have these people then that are suffering, again, needlessly.
Yes.
If I can kind of use that loosely. And again, too, you know, kind of getting at this picture, it would be interesting to talk to people who are in Scientology about like with mental health conditions. Obviously, they might not admit it or whatnot, but like what I'm saying is it would be interesting to see their degree of like self-esteem. So, for example, we know that there is a relationship, a correlation between those with ADHD and low self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
This is a consistent research finding, and a lot of the rating scales that I use in my diagnostic work. Not only does it ask about ADHD symptoms, it asks about self-esteem, because we know that it's a common finding. And it's probably to do with the negative messages that people with ADHD typically receive, right?
Yeah.
Like, so for example, my 6th grade middle school teacher called me motor mouth, made me sit by myself, right? I had to sit away from my peers. Gonna say, I still carry that with me. Like, that's not something that I've clearly forgot. So what I'm saying is that, like people that aren't in a cult are already tend to on average experience more low self-esteem. And it's like, I couldn't even imagine being in Scientology and then like with maybe some of these punishments and these other kind of things. It's like, it'd be interesting to compare those groups, is what I'm saying in my rambling, as far as how they feel about themselves.
I agree with that completely. And I've known many who've left and then got the help that they needed, the evaluations that they needed, and them finding out that this is something that's fairly normal and a lot of people experience. And it's a matter of using the tools that you can use, right, to mitigate those things, and recognizing that, oh my gosh, it wasn't that I wasn't just an a-hole, right? Like you were made to believe. And punishment, punishing someone you can't punish the ADHD out of someone. I don't think you can, but they try to in the field.
Yeah, well, and again, you're getting to this idea of, I go back to a lot of things when it comes to like shame and guilt, especially with mental health concerns. There's this sometimes for some people, there's this degree of shame because we look at some of the things as quote unquote our fault. Oh, it's my fault that I do these things. I argue we all have a sense of responsibility. We are all able to respond to things, and it is up to us, if we have difficulties, to try and learn ways to manage them. But I think like that to me is a damaging thought, a damaging aspect of like when you look at some of these conditions and that are, not to get too philosophical, but some of these conditions truly all are out of our control. Like you're not going to think your ADHD away. Now you can change some of your thoughts that may be exacerbating your symptoms, right? But you're not going to think yourself out of ADHD. Like that's just not how it works, right? So whereas when we look at like cognitive behavioral therapy to help people kind of change some of the ways that they perceive and think about them, saying things in a more helpful way, like we can do that to kind of mitigate depression, anxiety, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to do that with ADHD. So what I'm saying in my ranting is like, it is highly biologically based. It is highly related to the prefrontal cortex here. And that's not something you're just going to think away. It's not your fault.
Yeah.
That there is truly something different about brain structure, brain architecture, and brain functioning. And so what I'm saying is, I think that when we use the science and we can kind of think about it from that sense, I hope for some people it can at least alleviate some of that shame or some of that guilt. It's like, no. Like that's just, I tell my clients, this is just kind of how your brain has developed.
Yeah.
And now it's up to you to learn skills to manage it.
And it's okay to need those skills and to use use those tools outside
100%.
of it. That was part of the problem in Scientology, is you are limited to the tools of L. Ron Hubbard. If you're using tools from the outside, you're not allowed to do that. Why aren't you using Scientology? Those are other practices. So even that would be invalidated.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just it's so fascinating.
it is. It is. And again, I would just always go back to this, like, it's just sad. I mean, again, of like, I think about, where the psychological science is in 2025. We still have a very long way to go. We know that not all that the treatments aren't perfect. They don't work for every single person, but I think that we have come a very long way in the things that we know that can help people. And then we have groups of people, some of them in Scientology or in other groups, that aren't even allowed to they aren't allowed the opportunity to experience relief and improve well-being. Like, to me, that's hard to sit with, and my heart goes out to those people. I mean, people in general, but especially too, of like, it's almost like you're stuck in a cell, you're stuck in a cage, and the key, you're stuck in a cage in a cell, but the cell is actually unlocked, but you don't know it.
Yeah.
And all you got to do is like push, right? And then but you've been told, no, there is no key, or you've been told a false key.
That is exactly it. And part of why I love, and I so appreciate that you come on and chat with me, is there are a lot of people who are what we call under the radar in Scientology and even in other high control groups, where I'm hoping too we can provide some other information to help people understand the psychology of it all. And also many of the people on my channel did not grow up in Scientology. The majority of my audience have never been in Scientology, but they relate and they get it because of their own trauma or their own struggles and what they've been going through. So it's so fascinating to me that a lot of, where I've had struggles due to being in a cult, so many people had those same struggles, yet they were never in a cult. So I think it just works so well.
yeah. Well, and it goes back to this point of like, there are, when it comes to human suffering, there are various processes and experiences. We have multiple processes that result in the same thing: psychological suffering, right? And it's like we can share in that commonality, whether you've been in an abusive relationship, whether you've been in a cult. Like, there are some of these processes and some of these experiences that are the same, and it's like, oh, okay, like, no, we didn't experience the same thing, but you get it. If we want to go to some other questions, I just want to share an example real quick, like an analogy. So I look at, when it comes to, I don't know, kind of like facilitating empathy, if you will, and these kind of things. I have experience running substance abuse groups in level 1 prisons. And so I was working with gentlemen who were incarcerated, and mostly for drug-related offenses. So if part of their parole was they had to go through my substance abuse treatment course to further their parole, to get out.
Okay.
And there would tend to be some gentlemen who would invariably end up asking me, one, have you ever had a substance use abuse problem, or have you ever used substances? And I would tell them no. But there's this myth in substance abuse treatment that you have to have had substance abuse problems to then treat people. That's just false. I mean, think about it. Like, you go to an oncologist if you have cancer. You wouldn't be like, have you ever had cancer before? Oh, you haven't? You can't treat me, right? So, but there's a high level of suspiciousness in treatment providers, like working with this group. But anyway, what I would say to them is, no, I have not had problems with substances. However, that does not mean that I haven't had family members who have had problems with substances. That doesn't mean that I haven't had that same experience. And I would say, I've never put my hand on a hot stove and burned my hand, but I know what it's like to have my hand hurt, right?
Yeah,
so just because we don't have the exact same experience doesn't mean that I can't understand some of your experience. And I think sometimes when some people chain themselves to their problems, one of the faulty assumptions is you can't help me because you've never been through what I've been through. And I argue that's just not true. If you, especially in psychology, if you work with a clinician who's at least demonstrating the willingness to listen to you and to tell you, you're right, I've never been through that before, that person's probably in a good spot to help you, you know? Sorry, it was again kind of tangential, but I wanted to bring that up of like, you know, we can all kind of share in our human experiences, though we may have never been in a cult, but we can still find commonality in our suffering.
Yes. And I think it's so much of why so many people come together here, even on my channel, because it's just that. And I've learned so much. There are so many people never in Scientology on this channel that will see something or they'll sum it up in a way that I just could not verbalize, either because I just would struggle to find the words. In fact, I was talking to, who was I talking today? I was talking to a bunch of people. I think I might have been talking to Aaron, but it could have been somebody else. And I used a Scientology word because I realized like, I'm not sure how to communicate that. Might have even been Phil Jones when we were talking. Anyways, there's a Scientology word. It's N theta, interbulated theta. So theta is like the energy that comes off of us, right? Because we're souls, a thetan. Interbulated theta is all that, you know, it's all upset and you know, low vibe. And I could not think of how to describe something. I was saying something had like something over here. I'm like, yeah, I don't want to connect to that. I mean, it's in theta. And I was like, oh my gosh, did I just say in theta? I did just say in theta. And whoever I was talking to was like, yeah, it is kind of hard to describe that, isn't it? And I'm like, what would be the non-Scientology word for being it's interbulated?
Well, that's the word that came to mind was turbulence. Like I was picturing like an internal like waves crashing amongst each other and kind of turbulence in a sense, just kind of like your head spinning and just kind of chaos with inside your mind. And I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's what I pictured.
Yes. Yeah, pretty much like that. And it just kind of caught me off guard because I'm like, wow, like because I try to use words that are not Scientology. But sometimes when I'm speaking to a former Scientologist, even like my sister, I can communicate a concept in a shorter period of time. It's like speaking another language.
Yeah.
Just for it. And I'll say, because my oldest daughter, of my 3 children, it was my oldest who was more involved in Scientology. And the other ones really, fortunately, were not that much as she was. And she was very trained in Scientology. She also very much so, since leaving, doesn't want anything to do with the language. She went on to get an education. She got a master's degree. And it's funny because sometimes even she'll get stuck like, oh my gosh, how do I explain this? And it's in part because part of it's not true. It just doesn't exist anyways. Like body thetans, there's no explanation outside of Scientology for alien souls being attached to humans because it just doesn't exist.
But I think you bring up a really important point though about communication, shared experiences, and language, right? And this is where like language is a really interesting phenomena, right? So actually this kind of brings us back to like the term gaslighting in and of itself, right? Like we're trying to really understand maybe what it is from a clinical standpoint, because there appears to be something to it, right? Like and this is the interesting thing with language, right? Is like there's if one person used the word and no one else understood what they referred to, the word would die, right? It wouldn't be used. But like we can clearly grasp the meaning and like explain like this is what I mean by gaslighting, right? And so you have this vocabulary, what it seems like you have this vocabulary that was used amongst people familiar with that term. You had an experience and you found a very concise, practical way to convey that. That just seems really interesting to me, and it kind of demonstrates how language can be used.
Yeah, very much so. And I know that, like, I've heard too before, right? Like, in fact, I think Itchy Thetans, hold on, did I just see where'd Itchy Thetans go? Where'd you go? Like here, is shedding the cult language important to healing?
Mm,
You know,
mm.
and I have felt that for me personally, I would say yes, but at the same time, I'm not bothered using Scientology. I can it's like it's another language. For those of us raised in Scientology, it is another language. And sometimes I guess personally, I don't have an issue. I don't get upset if somebody uses Scientology words with
Yeah,
me. I get upset if they quote L. Ron Hubbard to me or try and make, do that. Then I'm
yeah.
like, oh, no, 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 no. No,
That's
you are not quoting that sociopath to me.
yeah, yeah, and that's a really interesting question too that Itchy Thetans
Yeah,
brings up as far as like healing and again, I don't think anybody's studied it of like kind of and I like that term too, kind of like shedding as a metaphor of like maybe shedding your Scientology skin, if you will. I think we're getting to this interesting point when we should do a study on it. I think it'd be really interesting to
yeah,
see a former Scientologist use of language. But I would argue maybe it seems like it is kind of an individual kind of thing where, Natalie, for you, it seems like, yeah, I'm fine with using it. Like you don't
yeah,
have this, aversive reaction to it. However, I could see someone maybe being overly aversive to it. And,
yeah,
and I think that it would depend on what we mean by healing. And again, there's no one path to healing.
exactly.
um I would be interested in to what degree is a person averse to using the word. So for me, I look at a lot of things as like functioning. So let's say that I was working with a client who is an ex-Scientology member who becomes incredibly angry and distressed every time they hear even the word Scientology,
Hmm.
where it's really turning up a lot of emotional difficulties for them. To me, that may suggest, and obviously I'd explore this more with the client, but if there's this connection between, distress at a word
Yeah.
and their psychological suffering, I might take that as an indication of these words are causing you a lot of problems and may be a roadblock to your healing.
Yeah.
Again, if you're having that large of an aversive reaction where you're like getting into arguments with family members, if they use the word, right,
Yeah.
and where it's creating distress and dysfunction,
Yeah.
that may, again, in this hypothetical example, that may be an area of therapy where I might say to the client, it seems like we've drawn this connection between, aversive reactions to these words, and it's causing you distress and it's causing you problems. Maybe we explore that a little bit more. Um,
Yeah. I get
so,
that. I can
yeah,
see that because it's really about, and I'm glad that you specify too, it's an individual thing, right? We can't say
yeah,
there's one size fits all healing.
yeah.
For me, I'm okay using the words at times. I don't have like a big reaction to it. I know people, like I know with my oldest daughter, if I want to talk to her about something and say I'm referencing it to something in Scientology, I'll say, "Hey, I'm going to use some Scientology terminology and concepts. Are you okay with that?" I do ask her because for
Nice.
her it can be triggering. For me it's often easier just to explain something. Jesse's got a question here. Does the language make people feel more important because not many people don't understand it? My opinion, Jesse, absolutely not. To me, that has nothing to do with it. It's not about other people not understanding. It's about some of these things are concepts that we grew up with, and there's not another way that really explains it. Whereas I can quickly say, and I know because as I get to know my friends who are former Scientologists, I try to be respectful of, okay, I don't want to use a Scientology word. Do you know another word for this?
Yeah,
Or if I have friends who have nothing on it, they don't care. Use it, don't use it, which is kind of the camp that I'm in.
Yeah.
and they'll use it and I'll go, oh yeah, I totally know what you're talking about. And so to Jesse's point though, I don't think it's because people don't understand. It's not like speaking, I remember when my daughter was learning Spanish and, it's like she could use a language I didn't understand,
Mhm. Yeah.
but it's really not about that. It's just really about, and again, growing up in it, I feel it's different. Those concepts have been with us our
Mm.
entire lives.
Mhm.
And if they don't exist outside of Scientology, or we don't know the psychological terms for it,
Mhm.
and if it doesn't bother me and it doesn't bother the person I'm talking to, then I'll just say, hey, these two people are, like two people going at it like this in Scientology, though that's called op-terming. They're opposition terminals. So we would always say, oh, those two are just op-terming. They're just
I'm sorry. Some of the language I just find really funny because it's like
Isn't
some
it?
Scientology language is it's lazy. It's like we're just gonna cut these words in half and smash them together. And it's like, but we already have terms for those. Like,
Yeah.
I get it from the stamp, and I think there have been movies and books written about this, about like making language more efficient, right? Like
Yeah.
I can see that, but it's like like come on.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's funny. One of these days I'll come up with a list, or we'll have a list of all the Scientology terms
Yeah.
and we'll have you react to them.
Okay,
And the
perfect.
concepts too, because L. Ron Hubbard stole a lot. So he called it something else in Scientology. He also redefined words. Does it matter to you? Not to me. Says I still shift into Scientology speak when I need to be with my father. Sometimes it's what triggers a memory.
Mm.
Oh, rib guy, that does, I can see that. That makes sense.
Mhm.
And Phil Jones says in response to Jesse, many Scientologists feel more important because they feel they have the answers to everything. And I would agree with that. That I think that's part of a lot of high control groups is it's very condescending. Like, well, we know. You see, they just don't know yet. Even within Scientology, it's condescending. My mom used to just piss me off all the time because when I was, clear in Scientology and she had done the operating Thetan levels, she's like, you just need to do your next step. And then when I got through operating Thetan level 4, so I learned about body Thetans, but we weren't allowed to talk about it. And I'd be having issues still in life. And other Scientologists would say, well, there's more to do. There's just,
And
your next step.
that's the parlor trick, right? Like that's the parlor trick it's moving the goalposts, right? Like Scientology is moving the goalposts. Like,
Yes.
oh, you're in the end zone, you scored a touchdown, and then Scientology's like, nope, move it back further, and then just keep moving it back. And it's like, wait a minute, like, what are you talking about? And it's interesting because as I was listening to say this, and like this idea of kind of moving the goalposts and like who has access to what knowledge and these kind of things. I mean, it kind of made me think of Buddhism. Not that Buddhism is Scientology. Like the Buddha said, this is open to all.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's this aspect, like with some religions, it's not. It's like, no, like I am no special person. Like, yes, I am the enlightened one, whatnot. But this is open to everybody. And I think like when I look at high control groups, or to me, a red flag of a concerning behavior is someone who claims to be the possessor of all. Because as a scientist, I operate from the standpoint of no, knowledge is open to all. Everybody, this democratic ideal, and that's an inherent part of science. And it's like, no. Like, we're not keeping this away from someone. I'm not telling people like, nope, only if you have a master's degree in psychology can I talk to you about this. It's like, no, like let's talk about like whatever you want to talk about, and I'll tell you what I think the literature says. Right?
Yeah, it is the opposite in Scientology.
Yeah.
And Jay here. So there's another word in Scientology, DevT. That's developed traffic. So that basically means when you're making more work for yourself or other people because you're a pain in the ass. Like you made a mistake and now we got to go do this over here. You've created more traffic. Now we got to do 5 emails instead of 1. You're inefficient in some way. So that's dev T. But you can, like, your kids are dev T. Like, don't be dev T right now. I'm trying to get ready to go on course. Like, you grow up with this
Wow.
understanding and belief that you cannot be a distraction to Scientology. And then within Scientology, like on staff and stuff, it's like, but they take it to whole new levels, because even in Scientology, humans are still humaning and can turn it into being abusive. There's a report. You can write what's called a dev T chit. So like a report on somebody, if they create this developed traffic for you, you can actually, one of the many reports in Scientology.
Wow. That's, again, going back to, like, I mean, I guess it's cool they shorten language, they shorten words for a concept. Wow. All right.
Yeah, exactly. I could go on and on and on with you, but I'm going to cut us off. Everybody hit that like and subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments on the replay. What do you think about gaslighting? Have you had an experience with it? And what do you think about what we talked about today? I want to hear from you guys. So yes. And Jordan, thank you so much. I can't wait to chat again. I thought this was a great topic, and I really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I love being here, and yeah, thanks for having me and listening and chatting. I enjoy it.
Absolutely. All right, everybody, you all go get out and have a cult-free night. I will see you later.